Hi everyone, welcome to this new video, and in this video we are going to see how we can configure our image scanning webhook. And this webhook is a Kubernetes mutating webhook, and this webhook is going to scan the container images, like whatever containers that we are going to run in the form of pods in our Kubernetes cluster. This is going to scan all those container images and only going to allow those container images where there is no vulnerability found, right? And this is configured in the mutating webhook, like the how we are setting up the mutating webhook, that will be configured in there. So let's go to the screen and let's try to understand what admission webhooks are. And by the way, like this is I have already discussed in one of the previous video, which was specifically around building a mutating webhook. And just a recap here. So mutating webhook are basically a way that allows you to intercept the request, and you can either validate those requests or mutate those requests. Like you can modify those requests as well, whatever request comes to the API server. And you can enforce some certain set of policies using the help of these webhooks. Let's say if you have some constraint, you want to set up some constraint, those can be done with the help of these webhooks. There's some usage of the admission webhooks, so you can basically restrict the resource creation based on some predefined rules. You can also validate some configuration against the policies that you wish to establish, and you can also mutate the resource specification to add either labels or annotations. Like whatever you want to do, you can do them with the help of these admission webhooks. Now we have two kinds of webhooks. This is again discussed in one of the previous video. So we have two kinds of webhook. First is the validating webhook, and second one is the mutating webhook. Now, as the name implies, validating webhook are those webhook where you just simply validate the request and we don't modify anything in the request part. And in case of mutating webhook, we tend to modify the request, like whatever request is received by the webhook server, we can modify that request and send back the response back to the API server. So this is the flow of how our admission control flow looks like. We have a API server which is running, and then there is a request that comes into the API server, then authorization happens, and after that we have admission webhook controllers that are running, which simply sends the request to the mutating webhooks. Now once the response is received back from the mutating webhook, it is sent for the schema validation, and after that, like finally the request is sent to the validating webhook. So if you have configured validating webhook, the request will receive at the last to those webhooks, and then finally the request is persisted to the etcd server. Now there are two components of the webhook server. Whenever you want to run a webhook, any type of webhook, whether it's a mutating or a validating webhook, there are two components that we have to set up. First is the webhook server itself, and in the webhook server we define or we configure how the request is going to mutated or validated. Now the other component is the webhook configuration. There are two kinds of webhook configuration. First is the mutating webhook configuration, and second one is the validating webhook configuration. Now in this configuration file, we define where our webhook server is present, like we give the URL of that webhook server. We also give the TLS credentials as well, like TLS, how to reach out to that webhook server. We also specify that on which objects should be captured by this webhook server, and only those objects or requests will be processed by the webhook server. So all these details are defined in the webhook configuration file. Yep. So now let's go into the demo part, and here the goal is that we will only run the pods or the container where there is no high or critical vulnerabilities. Like if there is a medium or low kind of a vulnerability that is available in those image, we are fine to run them. But if there is any high or critical vulnerability, then we don't want to run those containers in the Kubernetes cluster. And for this demonstration, I'm going to use a tool called Snake. So Snake allows us to scan the container images, and that is what I'm going to use here. Now the idea here is very simple, that whatever request we get, and here I'm talking about the pod creation request. So whatever pod creation request we get, we are simply going to receive it at the webhook server, and then we are going to mutate that request. So what additionally we are going to do there, we are going to add some init containers, and those init containers are going to perform the image scan. And if the output of that image scan is successful, then only the containers will run up. But if there is any vulnerability that is found out in those containers or on those images, then we are simply going to exit out from the init container. So let me bring up my code here. So this is the code that I have, and let's take a walkthrough of this code. So if you see here, this is the webhook that is built using operator SDK, and the additions that I have done is here. So here you can see that I'm starting up a webhook server, and here I'm passing the port and the certificates, because webhook server needs TLS credentials or TLS request to proceed. So this is the port, and port I'm getting from this environment variable called port. If there is no value that is given to this port, then the default value is 9000. Same goes for certificate as well. Like this is the directory basically, like where exactly the certificate is stored. Now the other important piece here is that I have a function called setup webhook manager, and if I go inside here I'm registering up the pod image scan webhook. Now if I go inside this function here, what I'm doing, I'm just simply creating up a object of pod image scanner. This is a custom type that I have defined here, and then I am registering up the webhook. So here you can see that I have a function called get mutate path. This takes the group version resource, and based on the group version resource, I am creating up a path for my webhook. Now the important function here is the handle function. Now once the request is received to the webhook server, this comes to the handle function, and handle function is the function where we are actually creating up a init container and modifying the initial request. So here you can see that I have defined I have a function called get init container, and this init container is what I'm adding back to my initial request, and then I'm simply sending up that patch back to the caller row. So in this case API server, so the request is sent back to the API server with the details of the init container, and init container contains the commands to run the snake test. Here you can see that I'm running this command called snake container test, passing up the image, and the threshold is set as high, and then it is getting stored, the output is getting stored in this file called result.json, and then we are just checking whether if there is any vulnerability, then simply exit out from here. So this is what we are doing here, and let's run the demo here. So first I'll just create a cluster. I create a local cluster. And I have given all the instructions in the readme file, like how to execute this particular piece. So first we will be creating up the TLS certificates. So let's create the TLS certificate. Now once the TLS CS certificates are created, we'll create certificates for the webhook. So I'm going to use the same key to sign the certificate for the webhook. So I'll run this command, and now I have the certificates with tls.cert, and the key is tls.key. Now once that is done, we'll simply create a web namespace called webhook, and I'm going to create a secret with name TLS, and this is going to have contain the TLS certificate and the key. So we have created this webhook namespace and a secret. So if I do get secret in webhook namespace, you can see that we have this particular TLS secret, and this secret contains the TLS certificate and the key. Now once that is done, we have to define the we have to run the webhook server, and that YAML file is defined here inside the deploy folder. We have a file called webhook server, and I have already built the image of this this webhook server, and I have pushed it to this location. So this is the image which is having that that entire implementation, and then I'm passing the snake token as well. So this is needed to do the scanning, and then these are the certificates that I'm mounting from the TLS secret that I have created. So I'll quickly run this. I'll go back to the README. I'll run this command, and this will go ahead and spin up a webhook server. Now if I do get pod in the webhook namespace, you can see that this pod is coming up. Now, once that is done, we have to create the other component that I was talking about, the mutating webhook configuration, and I have a template here. So if you can see, this is a template, and in this particular template, you can see that I have to give the path over which my webhook server or the particular endpoint is available. So this is the endpoint which our API server is going to call whenever the pod request comes up, and this webhook is available in this namespace, which is webhook, and this is the service name, and the service is exposed to port 443. So if I go to the deployment of the webhook server, here you can see the port is exposed as 443. This is the target port on which my webhook server is running. And if I go to the template back, here I want to show you one more thing. Here you can see that we are looking for only those objects where the scan property is set as true, which means the objects or the pod where there is a label called scan equal to 2, we are only going to scan those images. If there is a pod which doesn't have this label, then it will not get scanned by the webhook server. Even the request will not even reach to the webhook server. And this is where we are defining that these are the rules, and only for create request we are going to call the webhook server. Now the webhook is running, and I'll go back to the README and I'll create the webhook configuration. So the webhook configuration is created. We can see that the mutating webhook configuration is created. And now what we can do, so I have two files here. One is the save pod.yaml. This is the YAML file which has this same set of labels, scan equal to true, and the image that you see here, this is the image that doesn't have any vulnerability, like no high or no critical vulnerability. Let's try to run this or apply this particular pod. So the pod is created. Let's see the pod. So if you see the pod here, you can see that we didn't have any init container here, but here you can see that there is a init container that is automatically added to this particular pod, and this init container is going to do the image scanning. And if the result of that image scanning is successful, like if there is no vulnerability, then only this pod will come up. Otherwise, it will always stay stuck in the error state. Let's see the status again. So let me describe this pod as well. So here we can see that this is the main container, the Nginx container, and on the top of this we added a init container, and the name of the container is image scan. Here you can see all the commands that we have specified in our code, in our implementation. They are kind of added here. So let's see the status again. And here you can see that the pod is now running successfully because there is no vulnerability found in this particular pod. Now I have one more pod definition, and here you can see that I'm using some old version, Nginx version 1.17.3. Again, I have added the label as scan equal to true because I want to scan this particular image. And now let's try to apply this particular pod, and let's see whether this particular pod will ever be able to come up or not. So if I do get pod, the scan is running, and in a minute or so we will be able to see that this pod is getting error out. Yep. So here you can see now the status is marked as error, and this pod will never be able to come up because there was a vulnerability that was found into this particular image. I'm talking about this Nginx version 1.17.3 Alpine image. There is a vulnerability, and according to our init container or the configuration that we have added, this pod will never be able to come up. And let me do one more thing. Let me just delete this pod. So now what I'll do, I'll simply comment out this label just to showcase you that this since this label is not available here, this will not get triggered by the webhook, and this request will never reach to the webhook server, and there will be no init container and no scanning will be performed on this particular container. So if I just do apply, This is created. Now if I do k get pod, here you can see that there is no init container now. Why? Because there was no such label called scan equal to true, and we bypassed this sending this request to the webhook server, and now this pod will be able to come up. So here you can see that now this pod is running. Why? Because this image is not scanned by the webhook server, and the reason being is that we have commented out these labels, we have removed these labels, and these labels were configured in the webhook server. So if I go to the webhook server configuration file, here you can see that we are looking for only those objects that matches these labels, and the label that we have given here is scan equal to true. So I'll go back to the presentation, and this is the implementation workflow that happened. Like whenever a pod creation request comes up to the Kubernetes, the request is sent as an admission review request as HTTP body to the webhook server, and against that particular request, admission webhook response is expected by the by the caller. Now admission review request is a JSON object that contains the resource, and in our case it was containing the pod definition with some extra metadata, and either we can allow that request or deny that request, or we can mutate something to that request. So in this case, we mutated the pod configuration. Like you saw that we added something called as init container to that pod, and that is where scanning was happening. Request allow or deny is controlled by setting up the allow flag. So if I go to the code back, and if I go to the webhook, pod scanner webhook, here you will be able to see that in the handle function, I'm simply allowing that request. So this is when I'm returning up this request response, I'm simply allowing up that request. If I go inside this function, here you can see that allowed is marked as true, which means that this request will be allowed and by the API server. Yep, so this was it for this video. Hope you got some insight how to implement some sort of webhook. And in this case, we tried to do the image scanning, like the container image scanning, and only allow the pods which doesn't have any vulnerability, specifically high and critical vulnerability. So this was it for this video. And if you like this video, then please like and subscribe to the channel. And I'll see you in the next one.